Who is Nimrod? What effect and impact did he have on the ancient world? And what influence does he have on the modern world? And what is the real reason for this global lockdown? And what is its connection to the book of Daniel? In this very in-depth study, we're going to see how the past affects the present. And as I encourage you at all times, please research everything you see in this study.
Well, there they are. Our new electronic media, or our new gadgets. You push a button and the world's yours. You know how they talk about the world getting smaller? Well, it's thanks to these that it is. Everywhere is now our own neighborhood. But not only is the world getting smaller, it's becoming more available and more familiar to our minds and to our emotions. The world is now a global village. A global village.
Any iPhone or any phone in the world, first connecting to the network when you want to use it, you're immediately known worldwide. I mean, all the switches have you, and they capture your IPs and all that in your phone and MAC numbers and all that. That's how they bill you. So that also is known by the network, and the implants, computer network exploitation implants they have around the world. This was in 2004 or 2010, somewhere in that range. They had over 50,000 implants in all these switches, servers, and networks worldwide. I mean, that means they own the entire network, so that if your phone comes on the air, then they can know who you are and where you are.
The Mantis camera is the most powerful camera in the world. We took the best cameras we could get, 19 of them, and put them together. You'll be able to see everything all the time, everywhere, find out who did it and where they went.
Imagine if you happen to attend a political rally or a political speech or even maybe a church service or any other event that the tech tyrants didn't approve of. The next time you go shopping, your tracking features might set off some alerts in the store. Big data will know which businesses have served you, and the digital dictators can target them unless they cancel your access.
The next few years are going to see a wide array of technology that allows you to blow things up, to kill, in a way we've never seen before in history.
The way the elite stays in power is also by shaping the way that we think.
The current global crisis has disrupted every aspect of our lives, but it has also presented us with an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to reset and accelerate efforts to improve the state of our world.
Since the pandemic started, democracy and human rights have deteriorated in 80 countries, according to Freedom House, a think tank.
Now, of course, we do have communities who do have entirely legitimate and understandable concerns about the vaccine. So we do know, for example, that in some of our Asian communities, in some of our black communities, there are long-standing concerns that actually go back generations.
We learned Pfizer is going to get nearly $2 billion, Moderna receiving $438 million in taxpayer money, and yet both companies have said they will not sell the vaccine at cost. They're going to make a profit on it. A global vaccination program without a vaccine that hasn't been fully developed yet, and a massive scaling up of how to produce one or several vaccines. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think about this effort.
We don't know if these vaccines will work. We don't know if they'll work to avoid deaths. We don't know if they'll work to avoid transmission.
There are many people that were led to believe that the 21st century, the click and collect digital age, was meant to usher in a new era of development and technological human innovation. But then something happened that changed the game forever. And many have observed that we are going right back to the Middle Ages. It sounds a bit odd to most. Though the modern Western mind has been shaped by the medieval church, we are definitely returning back to the Middle Ages, where a number of years before the 2020 lockdown, many have observed that the issues of modern day housing is a return right back to the Middle Ages. The modern day lockdown is a medieval weapon, and the quarantine also goes back to the Middle Ages, where they want to detain individuals who they think are dangerous to the public. During the plague of medieval Europe, it made men richer, and today men like the Jesuit-educated humanist Dr. Anthony Fauci is the highest paid person of all of the 4 million federal government employees. The Catholic Church in America has received the largest federal taxpayers' aid in billions, more than any other business, though the Associated Press documented that 112 of her dioceses has over $10 billion in cash. The war over free speech is another medieval gag that many have said will worsen the coronavirus crisis and will shut down any dissenting voices all over the world, whether they are in Iraq, Africa, China, Hungary, Latin America, or the social media giants who are either colluding with states to shut down dissent or are threatening states who do not play ball. The Pope has said that there are limits to free speech and that religion should not be confined to your own personal conscience. But in late January 2021, he warned that another genocide like the Holocaust during the Second World War is possible. Why would he say something like that? That's interesting. When you tell people that all roads are leading to Rome, they laugh and mock. But a book titled God's Jury, the Inquisition and the Making of the Modern World shows that they know where things are going. The author, a practicing Roman Catholic, confirmed on NPR News in 2012 that the Inquisition is alive and well after 800 years, and the Inquisition's methods of surveillance, interrogation and repression are still having haunting echoes today, according to the London Times. The lockdown has only accelerated what was already in place, where nation states that were once fairly free have now turned into surveillance states where free citizens are now unnecessary targets. One of these states is the UK, the first nation in the world to have a high number of CCTV cameras. In January 2021, the British government is pushing for a bill for UK children to be spies among their own families and to report their own parents to the state if they're not complying by the law. The UK government in the second lockdown is also encouraging neighbours to snitch on each other, all the trappings of the medieval papal Inquisition. But there is something else that, although has been around for years, is slowly creeping back and is becoming ever so prevalent. One of the striking characteristics of the Middle Ages was feudalism, and historians who are carefully observing the economic structure of how this world is currently being run are seeing that we are cleverly going right back into feudal times, though your average person is unaware. This may be a new term to people who are not familiar with how many ancient societies around the world once operated, but what exactly is feudalism and what did it consist of? According to the Concise Oxford Dictionary, it is a medieval European form of government based on relation of vassal and superior, arising from holdings of lands in a feud. Popery infused herself into the governments of Europe and bind the kingdoms into one vast confederation, Dr. Wiley said. And in feudal times, the lord of the soil were accustomed to put collars with their names inscribed upon the necks of their slaves. Feudalism, the late Walter Rodney said, involved great inequality in distribution of land and social products. That sounds familiar. The landlord class and its bureaucracy controlled the state and used it as an instrument for oppressing peasants, serfs, slaves, and even craftsmen.
Bill Gates has been snatching up 242,000 acres of farmland across the US, enough to make him the top private farmland owner in America. According to the Land Report, the tech billionaire has been purchasing agricultural land for years, building a massive portfolio of farmland in 18 states.
If you study many of the modern conflicts in the world and nearly all of the minor and major wars from the beginning of time right up until today, they all have one striking similarity. They are all over control of land and its natural resources. For the more land and territory you have to govern, the more autonomy and control you have over a geographical region. There are many that have observed that ownership of land gives one a sense of power, and the not too distant future plans is to make the global village society totally dependent upon the state. That's the idea, and in countries like the United States of America, that usually sets trends for the rest of the world, with most of its land being owned and controlled by a number of billionaires, we can see what direction the world is going, especially with a global collapse of the middle classes in nearly every region of the planet. With around 900,000 small firms at risk and 6 million small businesses and 16 million jobs in a precarious position in the UK, England has never been fully free of feudalism, where half of its land is owned by less than 1%. And it has led to a deep inequality where poor tenants pay for landlords to live like kings, and Britain's feudal household system is killing the dream of home ownership. And when 70,000 households in the UK have been made homeless during the pandemic, we can see where things are heading. If they really wanted to, they could alleviate world poverty, but with a few individuals controlling most of the world's wealth, where global workers have lost earnings of $3.7 trillion since the start of the lockdown in March 2020, and with more and more people worldwide losing their jobs, their houses, their savings and their livelihoods, the feudal system is being cleverly resurrected all over again. But even in an age of oppression, there were some in the Middle Ages who made a stand against that system. All over London, England, there are names of individuals on pubs, and there are landmarks of individuals who had lost their lives for the freedom of their fellow Englishmen. It is an episode of British history that has been almost lost in oblivion, an era lost in time, that is only familiar to those who are studying medieval history. But there are some key object lessons to learn from the past, for history does repeat itself. In London's National Archives, there are documents of warrants for people's arrest, where men and women in 15th century England were arrested by the military when they had illegal social gatherings, like today. Some caved into the pressure of the state, but others stood their ground. Bible studies were broken up, for it was illegal in 1400s England to have a possession of a Bible. In an era where your average person was illiterate, men and women had to be on the lookout just so they could read or hear a word from the Holy Scriptures. There were others who were a bit more bold and had the people's interests at heart, not caring for their own lives. In a time when there was no apps, no smartphone, no vlogging, no satellites, no internet, no e-commerce, no hard drive, no SIM card, no public libraries, no bookshops, no coffee shops, no planes, no tubes, no trains, no radio, no shipping industry, no stamps, no keyboard, no typewriter, no newspapers, and no printing press. Men translated the Bible by their own hands with just ink and paper. And the man who was credited with this very deep task was a man called John Wycliffe, or some call him Whitcliffe. In the late 1300s, he educated young men to go throughout the British Isles and to teach an illiterate nation to read. He lived during the plague, the Black Death, in an era where many questioned the established position in society that is very similar today, where many people are also questioning the established positions in society and are asking many questions, for they want clarity and not outdated theories. His phrases still dominate the religious and political freedoms of the United States, a phrase that has been credited to Abraham Lincoln but can be traced to John Wycliffe, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. He was a diplomat and an excellent debater in Parliament, an Oxford professor with a doctorate in theology and in divinity, a political reformer, a preacher who was educated in the law of optics, the physiological genesis of sleep, chemical analysis, national economics, and geometrical and arithmetical rules. And at first he had full support of the nobility and many in high places. But when he spoke against the dominant established view of society, all of his close friends and people in society abandoned him, and he was left alone, but he stood his ground. You never really know who your true family and friends are until a crisis hits, and people who you think you can trust will abandon you when there is surrounding pressure. And in this climate, when the famous are the influential voices for setting trends, what will start off as a choice with the vaccine will eventually be pressured upon society. And there are men who have studied the psychology of human behavior and have been made aware of how to manipulate the masses. Walter Lippmann in 1920 said the manufacture of consent will alter every political calculation and modify every political purpose. Modern propaganda, Edward Bernays said in 1928, is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group. And it is obvious, Ivan Pavlov said in 1927, that the different kinds of habits based on training, education, and discipline of any sort are nothing but a long chain of conditioned reflexes. So how do you condition people through propaganda to manufacture consent?
On day one, there were 2 people, and then 4, and then 16. In 3 months, it's 1 billion. That's where we're headed.
Entertainment many times forewarns you of what is to come. They do give you a heads up, but they also press you many times to conform. But what is more sad is that members of the current British government are being inspired by these films to govern the nation. What a sad state of affairs when a nation's domestic policy is modelled on a Hollywood film. Something feels quite sinister and wrong. It looks like it was well mapped out. Governments are able to orchestrate things a lot more quicker and effectively because more and more of the world's population have crowded themselves into big cities looking for work. The London Guardian said that we should empty half the world's human population and squeeze them into cities. The United Nations says most people now live in cities, and it is estimated that more and more are flooding in. This makes it far more easier to control people if they are concentrated into one small space. Stephen Graham, an English professor who was monitoring the growth of cities around the world and modern technology, published his research in a book titled Cities Under Siege in 2010, and has shown where the influx of modern urban city dwelling is leading to. He said that at the dawn of the 20th century, 1 in 10 of the Earth's 1.8 billion people lived in cities. Between 1957 and 2007, the world's urban population quadrupled. By 2007, half the world's 6.7 billion people could be classed as city dwellers. Given the density of cities, more than half of humanity is currently squeezed onto just 2.8% of our planet's land surface, and the squeeze is tightening day by day. By 2050, fully 75% of the world's estimated 9.2 billion people will most likely be living in cities. As Keith Dixon, a US military theorist of urban warfare, puts it, the increasing perception within Western militaries is that for Western military forces, asymmetric warfare in urban areas will be the greatest challenge of this century. The city will be the strategic high ground. Whoever controls it will dictate the course of future events in the world. As there is no reversing the trend of this coronavirus world order, and as many are seeing that cities are turning into surveillance hubs, monitoring your every move, and that parts of the world are also becoming a lot more drone infested and militarized like never before, people who have the money that gives them more options are fleeing the cities in droves, especially in Britain and in the United States. Those are options you have if you have strong faith and an economic plan to fall back on, where you can escape an environment that is being riddled with crime and is becoming a lot more controlling.
Americans fleeing big cities in record numbers, with many preferring the suburbs during the coronavirus pandemic.
Many city residents are eyeing greener pastures.
The pandemic has people rethinking living in the big city, and some families are leaving for greener pastures.
Since the pandemic started, California is seeing an exodus, a mass exodus.
And so we find that as of the middle of July or so, about 15 to 20% of the population of Manhattan has actually left.
That the wealthy are leaving high-tech cities and states during COVID.
In the Italian countryside, a new phenomenon. Young Italians rediscovering agriculture.
Number 60, Jason Brown, was one of the best centers in the NFL.
At one point, he had a 5-year, $37 million contract with the St. Louis Rams.
Brown walked away from a $37 million contract and hung up his cleats.
Not in man's standards, but in God's eyes. A life of greatness. I think about a life of service.
He calls it First Fruits Farm.
Jason grows food to give it away,
where the first harvest is all donated to feed the hungry.
We have a list of names and we share, because sharing is caring.
Jason has 1,000 acres here, which could go a long way toward eliminating hunger in this neck of North Carolina.
Love is the most wonderful currency that you can give anyone.
Never stop giving, never stop loving, never stop growing.
What would happen if more people had that mentality, planting your own food and helping those who are in need, especially in this uncertain climate? That man is an inspiration, but sadly, most people don't even have basic survival skills. If you do have the economic means and are able to leave the cities to go into the country, one thing you will definitely need is a car to get from A to B, especially if you have a family. The narrator can honestly confess that from a child he has always preferred the country to the city, especially when he went to the coast of Britain in Iona, Scotland, and fed the sheep. It was a joy, and most of his inspiration is when he is filming and observing nature. It is a lot better than gossip and watching TV. But when was the first time in recorded history that a man left the corruption of the city life to live an independent life among nature? It was when the patriarch Abraham migrated out of Ur of the Chaldees to live in the land of Canaan. But what exactly was he leaving behind? What was that culture like? The city of Ur was dedicated to the moon god, as can clearly be seen by slender seals from the early kings of Ur down to the Chaldean priests in King Nebuchadnezzar II's court. People eat liver, but in ancient Babylon they would open up the entrails, and the prophet Ezekiel recorded that the Chaldean priests practiced occult divination through the liver. But what impact does that Mesopotamian culture have on the modern world? It was a culture of superstition and fear, where they believed that every single disease, bad omen and epilepsy was as the result of a demon. They believed in vampires, and the Irish writer Bram Stoker only revived this culture of fear. Its most feared deity was Pazuzu, known as the Lord of the Air, and this deity got a facelift in 1973 in the film The Exorcist. The men of that region were brilliant astronomers who mapped out the heavens and recorded their detailed account of the heavenly bodies. But they turned the planetary stars into deities, and the astrological gods Scorpio, Sagittarius, Pisces, Leo, Capricorn, Aries, Taurus, Virgo and Aquarius can all be traced right back to the Middle East, and today's millennials are only going back to the pagan practices that Abraham left behind to serve the true and almighty God, Yahweh. Anu, the sky god, is a star on this Babylonian brick, and is one of the leading pendants people wear around their necks today, especially those in the New Age or in the occult. Everything in nature was worshipped in ancient Babylon, and their gods are getting a new facelift.
In this trident resides the power of Atlantis. In the wrong hands, it would bring destruction. But in the hands of the true heir, it would unite above and below.
The god with the pitchfork in its hand is found outside St. Paul's Cathedral, on a coin of the Roman ruler Pompey. Among the Greek gods of Olympus, among the many deities in India, the Pakistani who introduced Buddhism into Tibet, and the gods of the Hittites, can all be traced to the lightning deities of ancient Babylon, as can be found on slender seals discovered in that region. The narrator was carefully observing women who are into modern witchcraft, and when you hear their testimonies, they all come from very, very troubled backgrounds and have issues. But when you see who they are worshipping, it is Lilith, the naked female Babylonian deity. The pentagram, the highest symbol in the occult, can also be traced right back to Babylon. The 16th century English occultist John Dee had one as one of his sacred occult objects, as can be seen in the British Museum. and occultists like Frenchman Eliphas Levi and his Baphomet figure that was adopted by Anton LaVey has the pentagram in the background. This Catholic church in London, England has one on the front of its building. And this Masonic lodge in London, England also has one on the floor in front of the building. And as you carefully look at modern day urban music videos and recent modern day horrors, you will still see that Babylonian symbol pop up and still used among many people who are into esoteric philosophy. This is what Abraham left behind, but who created this system in Sumer and introduced the first modern cities? The 33rd degree Freemason Manly P. Hall said he was the first worshipped deity in ancient Babylon. We're going to take a very careful, analytical, historical, and spiritual approach to this episode of human history and look at an individual whose system men are still trying to revive. One example is of the EU building headquarters, and its design is a copy of the work of an artist who painted the Tower of Babel that can be seen also on this poster. The European Union depicts mankind as robots and that they are trying to restore a system. In a Marvel comic, The Power of X issue number 1 released in late 2019, the front cover has an individual on the top right with pink smoke coming out of his eyes. He is a sentinel, a being far stronger than a human and a mutant, and his name was, guess what? Nimrod, and used something to control people inside of the city. It was a tall building called the Tower of Nimrod, or the Tower of Babel. Marvel is familiar with the Holy Scriptures, for when God did tell the nations after the flood in Genesis chapter 9 to spread out, multiply and replenish the earth, they disobeyed, and God stepped in and he did something to destroy their rebellious plans.
जम्मू कश्मीर के राज्यपाल सत्यपाल मलिक ने अफवाहों पर ध्यान नहीं देने
የጠቅላይ ፍርድ ቤት ፕሬዝዳንት ወይዘሮ ማዛ አሸናፊን በጉዳዩ ዙሪያ ተጨማሪ ማብራሪያ
του ασύλου που αποτέλεσε και προεκλογική δέσμευση του Κυριάκου Μητσοτάκη κατατέθηκε στη Βουλή το βράδυ της Παρασκευής.
In order to clearly understand this early episode of human history, we have to go right back in time to the earliest documented record of human migration, the Toldot Benai Noah. In Genesis chapter 10 verses 8 to 12, we are introduced to an individual called Nimrod ben Cush, the world's first post-flood king and ruler. Twice he is called a mighty hunter. That shows that he must have done something very extraordinary to impress people and to establish his global reputation. The English word mighty is a translation of the Hebrew word gaber that means giant, so he must have been very big in stature. Coming from the most mineral-rich continent in the world named after his father, Africa, the land of Kush, he must have passed through the longest river in the world in northeast Africa, the River Nile, to establish his short-lived empire that was geographically situated among another well-known water supply, the Euphrates River, that ran from Armenia into the Persian Gulf according to Herodotus and flowed right through the middle of Babylon. He must have cleared the Mesopotamian plains of its vegetation and tamed many of its wild animals. For continuing the tradition of Cain, he must have understood maths, the chemical changes in soil oxidation reduction, and he must have been a land surveyor, for he embarked on a very intense architectural construction project by building a very vast city complex on the plains of Shinar, ancient Sumer in the Orient, the Middle East. The world's oldest known maps of cities and temples carved into stone have been discovered among the ruins in Iraq, and the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England has some of the oldest plans and layouts of ancient temples. It is only when you read the following chapter, Genesis chapter 11, that you see that God had to directly step into the affairs of man and disrupt Nimrod's one world government plans. But his reputation still had a lasting effect and impact on the living memory of early man that was to impact every culture on the planet. The gods Gilgamesh of Iraq and Hercules of Greece are just different names for the same deity, who is usually depicted as a very strong and naked muscular figure whose reputation is gained by fighting a bull and, as we shall see, other animals. According to the Sumerian king list, Gilgamesh was the world's first superhero and tablets in the library of King Ashurbanipal showed that his reputation was still preserved intact in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Greek historian Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, mentions Orion and Memnon, the Ethiopian warrior king, and the 1973 Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that Orion is a major constellation, a mighty hunter, of great beauty and gigantic strength. In the lower world, his shade is seen by Odysseus driving the wild beasts before him, as he had done on earth, as recorded in Homer's Odyssey. After his death, he was changed into the constellation called by his name. It took the form of a warrior wearing a girdle of 3 stars and a lion's skin and carrying a club and a sword. Deified and worshipped as the Egyptian or Kemet god Usa, known in Latin as Osiris, and the Greek god Memnon, Nimrod started a kingly trend where mortal men, when elected head of a state, turned into gods and were worshipped in life and in death. The Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, were associated with Osiris in death, where they taught that they would be with him in the afterlife. And as you go through ancient Afro-Eurasia, each government's kingship continued the role of Nimrod while ruling on earth. But how can we piece together this man's legacy and the impact it has had on our world today? We have to be very disciplined in order to carefully analyze the many different places where history has been preserved. In the earliest ancient texts carved into stone, on ink on the earliest paper, papyri, the similar symbols and the phonetic sounds in the ancient and in the modern languages. In an ancient ritualistic dance that can tell a story of a bygone age in oral tradition. The archaeological record, early cylinder seals, and the intellects in the modern Western world who could skillfully analyze antiquarian secular manuscripts and align their record with the accounts in the Holy Scriptures. Let us begin our journey. There are statues on buildings in London, England, of a man who is little known today unless you are studying English literature, the 17th century English poet and statesman John Milton. Respected as the modern world's champion of free speech and the free press in his Areopagitica, that Americans class as the foundation of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, his most respected work is his 1667 work of 10,000 lines of verse, Paradise Lost, that was compiled when he was totally blind. And when describing Nimrod in poetical language, John Milton said, "Hunting and men, not beasts, shall be his game, with war and hostile sneer such as refuse, subjection to his empire tyrannous, a mighty hunter, thence he shall be styled before the Lord as in despite of heaven." Scientist Sir Isaac Newton is another Englishman that has monuments throughout London, England, that have also been erected in his honour. Today, instead of deifying him, men are studying him more closely from a carefully scrutinised and analytical perspective. And as scholars pore over his vast collection of unpublished works, though he was known as a pompous, argumentative, vengeful scientist, and whether you agree with his Aryan views or his date for the predictions of the second coming of Christ, he had something that has clearly been lost in our time, a daring, curious mind who was not afraid to experiment and step outside of his comfort zone to discover new truths. In his posthumous work, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, Sir Isaac Newton said that Nimrod founded a kingdom at Babylon and perhaps extended it into Assyria, but his kingdom was but of small extent if compared with the empires which rose up afterwards. One of the earliest archaeologists of ancient Greece was a Frenchman who followed in his father's footsteps by collecting a vast coin collection and by visiting and learning about ancient Egypt. He also briefly fought as a soldier in the Franco-Prussian War, and he became a professor of archaeology at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. He was the first to identify Akkadian, the first non-Semitic language of the early Sumerians. And in his book Chaldean Magic and Astrology, Assyriologist Francois Lenormand wrote that one of the two elements of the race inhabiting the countries watered by the lower course of the Euphrates and Tigris, the famous Ethiopians or Cushites of Babylon, whose existence is proved by so many passages of classical antiquity and the sacred writings. The Bible connects with these Cushites the name of Nimrod, which is used both as a name of a hero and as a name of a place, like all those contained in the same chapter of Genesis. In the 1865 first edition of a concise dictionary of the Bible that had 65 contributors, its editor, English lexicographer Sir William Smith, continuing from the moment, said that Cush, the name of a son of Ham, as a country appears to be Africa. Nimrod, a son of Cush and grandson of Ham, established an empire in Shinar, the classical Babylonia. There is abundant evidence that the race that first held sway in the lower Babylonian plain was of Cushite or Hamitic extraction. The Cushites appear to have spread along tracts extending from the higher Nile to the Euphrates and the Tigris. The University of Oxford in central southern England is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, and for the past 5 years has retained its reputation as the world's best university. One of its 19th century history professors, who was one of the 65 contributors to a concise dictionary of the Bible, George Rawlinson, younger brother to the linguist and Assyriologist Sir Henry Crensick Rawlinson, published a multi-volume set titled The 7 Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World. And when documenting the life of Nimrod using original primary sources, he said that Nimrod, the son or descendant of Cush, set up a kingdom in lower Mesopotamia, which attracted the attention of surrounding nations. A primitive Babylonian kingdom is assigned to a people distinctly said to have been Cushite by blood. The people whom he led came probably by sea. At any rate, the earliest settlements were on the coast, and Ur or Hur on the right bank of the Euphrates. At a very short distance from it, Embutra was the primitive capital. There is little doubt but that it is in honor of his apotheosis that the constellation Orion bears in Arabian astronomy the title of El Jabbar, or the Giant. The narrator paid a visit to Dorset in southwest England and discovered that it has the most expensive road to buy a house on in the world, a place called Sandbanks Street. Buried in a churchyard in Dorset is the grave of a man who was fluent in 3 languages, and his grave shows his credentials carved into marble. His name? Sir Austin Henry Layard. He was born in France to an English father and a Spanish mother. He was raised and educated in the UK, in Venice, Italy, and in Switzerland, so he was well travelled and would spend time in the Middle East. He was a member of the British Parliament and a British ambassador to both Constantinople in Turkey and in Spain. But his greatest contribution was his role as an archaeologist, for in the British Museum are housed many artifacts that he amazingly transferred from Iraq all the way to London. The Assyrian section is called Nimrod, the name the co-prophet of Isaiah gave to that section of Iraq. Layard was also one of the 65 contributors to a concise dictionary of the Bible, and in his 1849 2-volume set Nineveh and its Remains, continuing the words of George Rawlinson, Layard also confirmed that the identity of Nimrod and the constellation Orion is not to be rejected. Most of the Greek authors confirmed by the Armenian historians tends to identify or to confound Ninus, the first king, with Nimrod himself. The tradition preserved by Berossus, which appears to attribute to a foreign nation arriving by sea the introduction at some remote period of civilization and certain arts into Babylonia. A YouTuber found the grave in Blackpool in northwest England of a man lost in history, African-American George Washington Williams. He fought in the US Civil War and only recently has he been recognized as an important individual. He visited Belgium and met King Leopold II, and the two men developed a deep mutual respect for each other. But that changed when Williams paid a visit to the country with the second largest rainforest on earth, the Congo. What he saw in the Congo appalled him. He saw that slavery under King Leopold II was still alive and fresh in Africa, and if he was alive today, 2 centuries later, it was seen that nothing has changed. The system still continues. For the cycling industry to function in the 19th century, they needed rubber, and Congo's rubber was extracted to benefit Scottish businessman John Lloyd Dunlop. And when tech corporations and men rise to the highest financial pinnacle on earth today, very few are aware that it is also the Congo's exploitation that makes them rich. Williams did not get to write about the Congo, but regarded as the modern world's first black historian, when attempting to reconnect to his African heritage, he came across Nimrod, and in his 1882 History of the Negro Race, that took 7 years to research, consisting of 1,200 pages with 12,000 books consulted, he recorded that Ham, it is said, is the progenitor of the Negro race, and Luther's German has for the word Ethiopia, Negroland, the country of the blacks. The Cushites, so frequently referred to in the scriptures, are the same as the Ethiopians. We find that Cush was the eldest son of Ham and the father of Nimrod. Nimrod, a Cushite, went to Ashur and built Nineveh. Nimrod, says the record, began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom, etc. He founded the Babylonian Empire and was the father of the city of Nineveh, one of the grandest cities of the ancient world. Post-Reformation Scotland produced some very solid intellects, and one of them has been an absolute asset to the narrator. He is the only Western writer the narrator has ever read who can approach a topic and explain it with an intellectual edge and depth. He was the leading authority in the 19th century on the papacy, and he travelled to Egypt, to Jerusalem, and to the Italian mountains to gather his research material. His grave is in Edinburgh, Scotland, where he sleeps awaiting the first resurrection. And Dr. James Aiken Wiley was awarded a doctorate by the University of Aberdeen, where he studied, for his skillful approach to history. In his A Journey over the region of fulfilled prophecy, continuing the school of thought, this is what he said about Nimrod. We were on the plains of Shinar. On this plain flourished the early kingdoms of Nineveh and Babylon, the first of the antediluvian kingdoms, embraced by the Tigris and Euphrates. A delicious sky, a fertile soil, and abundance of water covered the plain everywhere with such richness and beauty that it looked like the picture of that celebrated garden which was the crown of the young world, and which there is every reason to believe somewhere in this very region. The footsteps of the mighty hunter, Nimrod, and the tower reaching to heaven was in early times the theatre of unrivaled glory, the scene of unexampled wickedness. The continent of Africa has some vital clues on how Nimrod ruled, for its many long-held traditions still remain intact over thousands of years. We shall briefly observe a few of them. What modern scientists have said is the best and most safest way for a mother to bond with its child, wrapping it around you, is still a long-held African tradition that dates back far into the past, as can be seen from this artifact from the Sudan in the British Museum, dated around 1500 BC. This painting in Egypt, dated to the 14th century BC, is in a tomb of Hu, viceroy of Nubia in the reign of Tutankhamun, that shows black Nubians with items that still exist today. The top row shows Nubian chiefs with the double feathers in their hair, and this is still a practice that exists today in the Sudan. The rulers of Babylon also had the double feather headdress as a sign of their authority. Each of the rows has a tributary of gold, an item that Nubians use for trade, and this is also still used or misused as wealth or trade in Africa. The top row has shields and pots as a tributary also, and if you go into the African section in the British Museum, they still make these earthenware clay pots today, as well as use these leather shields also. The bed with the wooden headrest was used as an ancient African custom of sleeping on, and in the British Museum, the ancient Egyptians used it as a headrest, whether it be made of wood or, on rare occasions, ivory. But it was also used in ancient Sudan and in modern-day Zimbabwe and in Somalia, where Somali men still use it today, as well as in different parts of Africa. So its traditions have stood the stress of time. But how is it connected to Nimrod? Let's see. Archery today is a sport that requires a skillful use of the bow and arrow. But before the advent of guns, this is what most nations used to fight with in battle in ancient warfare. The bow and arrow was used in war between the English and the Norman French army in 1066 in the Battle of Hastings. Genghis Khan, the Mongolian ruler who had the largest empire in history covering a land mass, won his battles in the 13th century by using very skilled archers on horseback. And as you go into the British Museum, the Assyrian section shows its kings and its military with the bow and the arrow in use, not only against human beings but against animals also. This was also practiced among the Medo-Persian kings. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II also has his bow and arrow in warfare, but it was the Black Nubians of the Sudan who used ringlets that had a renowned reputation as very skilled and pinpoint accurate archers in the ancient world, where they had a military battalion in the Medo-Persian Empire and were also loyal mercenary soldiers in the Egyptian army. The ancient Nubian civilization was called Tar Seti, a name known from Egyptian writings that means land of the bow, referring to the weapon which apparently was deemed characteristic of peoples of that part of Africa, according to the New York Times. And when archaeologists have recently excavated the caves in southern Africa, they discovered the oldest evidence of archery in the world, where credited Western peer reviews not only confirm that they not only had the oldest bow and arrow technology in the world, but deep inside of a cave they discovered the very oldest image in the world thus far on record of an archer. This was the weapon of choice by the mighty hunter Nimrod, who is depicted as the astrological deity Sagittarius with the bow and arrow, as well as on Neo-Assyrian cylinder seals, and also as the terrestrial god in the heavens, Orion, the mighty hunter. When you pass through an African village, there is a tribe that has preserved a custom that can also be traced back to Nimrod. The slender Nilotic tribe of East Africa, the Maasai, have a custom that initiates a male into manhood and guarantees him a wife. It is the killing of a lion, and when they walk through those plains, the lions are aware that it is warfare time and usually move along, for they have a reputation of taking out those felines with accuracy with their spears. In northern Iraq, the ancient Neo-Assyrian Empire was also known for their lion hunts. The British Museum is full of these images of this deep-rooted ancient custom. And like the Maasai, Assyrian kings like Ashur-banipal and his family fought lions to prove their superhuman virility. But where can this custom be traced to? The first recorded king on the Assyrian plains, Nimrod ben Cush. The Greek god Hercules wore the mantle of the lion either on his shoulder or upon his head, and Greek kings like Alexander the Great struck medals of himself in honor of Hercules or Nimrod, who he thought he represented in battle. When he defeated Darius the Mede, this carving shows him wearing the headgear of Hercules, and as already shown, Hercules is the Greek form of Gilgamesh, who is also depicted as defeating a lion on a Babylonian cylinder seal in the British Museum and on this Neo-Assyrian monument in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. The religion of Nimrod has been deeply preserved in India, where the half-human, half-fish Vedic god was imported from Sumeria. And the Indus Valley civilization has a deity in a yogi position with a crown of 2 horns on his head surrounded by animals. But this image was not distinct to India alone. The people of modern Europe are unaware that they also once had the exact same deity. For this northern European Celtic god Cernunnos also has horns on his head and is also surrounded by different animals. That was also the same deity that was worshipped. This horned deity was also in Greece in southern Europe. But the home of Nimrod's rebellion was in the Middle East, and even in the 21st century, his name has still been preserved in the Middle East when you look at these news reports in Iraq documenting the land of Nimrod. Nothing has changed since God disrupted the nations at the Tower of Babel. And in cylinder seals in the British Museum are the images of the horn god Nimrod, and Mesopotamian kings like Naram-Sin would wear the horned mitre crown on his head in memory of Nimrod. This is also what Northern European warriors would wear in battle, that is still expressed by the fighting warriors in the video game The Elder Scrolls. And as you carefully look through films and modern music, whatever this man did at the Tower of Babel, you can clearly see that his rebellion has still left a very deep impact on our world today. For Nimrod used a city complex in Iraq to control all of the nations. And guess what? History is repeating itself all over again. For if 3/4 of the world's population are tightly squeezed into a tiny space and is absolutely totally dependent upon the state for food, water, gas, electricity, petrol, clothing and the internet, and if a few tech giants control how the world functions, we are going right back to the days of Nimrod. For in Genesis chapter 11, man tried to establish a name in Nimrod's rebellious system, and in Revelation chapter 13 verse 17, at the end of time, that oppressive rebellious system will be repeated all over again. The characteristic trait of Babylon was pride, according to Jeremiah chapter 50 verses 1 and 31. And the ancient pagan systems of Babylon and Egypt were deeply rooted in self-worship. The key words in Daniel 4:30 of Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh king of Egypt in Ezekiel chapter 29 and verse 3 are I and my. And when the kings of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 14 verses 4 and 11 are described as a pompous oppressor, the succeeding verses teach us who they modeled their character after. Isaiah chapter 14 verses 12 to 15 introduces a character called Hallel in Hebrew, but in the Latin he is called Lucifer, light bearer, before his name changed to Satan in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. And his beef with God was the same issue man has on earth: self-worship. The key word that is repeated 5 times is I again. As we go into the book of Daniel, we will see that the rebellious system that started with a descendant of Ham continued with the Asiatic descendants of Shem and will end with the Occidental European descendants of Japheth. So we have laid a nice solid foundation. We understand who Nimrod is, the system he set up, what Abraham left behind, and how that system still has an effect on our modern world. And we've seen how the lockdown is the grand finale of something men have been planning for years. And as we go into the book of Daniel, we're going to see how different empires have tried to rebuild and restore Nimrod's system, and how God is eventually going to shut it down. In order to understand the prophetic book of Daniel, we have to travel through the corridors of time. For in order to understand the present and the future, you have to understand the past. Many look at prophecy as this very huge and difficult maze where they think they will get lost and confused in the hermeneutics of prophetic language. And with so many different schools of prophetic interpretation, many become confused. In order to clearly understand this prophetic book and have confidence in its authenticity, we have to approach it through a number of qualitative research disciplines. The first is the science of archaeology, where in the 19th century Sir Austin Henry Layard unearthed many artifacts in Iraq, and his co-Assyriologist Sir Henry Cranch Rawlinson deciphered them, some with the name inscribed in cuneiform of the Babylonian ruler King Nebuchadnezzar II, who the prophetic charter in Daniel started with. The science of linguistics, especially the different Semitic languages of the Near East, help us to understand the original language of the book of Daniel, where men like German Lutheran Orientalist Heinrich Friedrich Wilhelm Gesenius and his Hebrew Chaldee lexicon has given us a clearer knowledge of the languages used in the Bible. We will also look into the manuscripts and the works of post-Reformation Western commentators, and will use them without always necessarily quoting from them, such as a new analysis of chronology by the Irish clergyman and scientific writer William Hales, all the antiquarian and classical writers like the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus and the 1st century AD Roman Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus, who Western scholars heavily rely on to give us a clearer picture of the Greco-Roman world. We will also look at the best and most reliable way of studying prophetic time. Most of the world uses the standardized Gregorian calendar. This was first introduced by Pope Gregory XIII, seated on the right in 1582, as the coin in the center in Latin numerals confirms, which is a modification of Julius Caesar's calendar of 45 BC that starts a new year in January and uses the solar calendar of 365 days that was also first used by the ancient Egyptians. But when studying prophetic time, we use the Hebrew calendar of 30 days, 12 months and 360 days, where the solar and lunar months are harmonized. That begins in the first Hebrew month Abib Nisan or March, and the Olympiads, the first Olympic of 776 BC, the founding of Rome in 753 BC, and Claudius Ptolemy's canon that chronicles the reign of the Roman, Egyptian, Grecian, Persian and Chaldean kings and eclipses during their reign from 747 BC to 137 AD will be the different starting eras we will use when measuring prophetic time. As English is the narrator's only language, we will be using the 1611 AD authorized version of the Bible as our standard. That will help us to break down biblical symbolism and to do a thorough exegesis, that is, comparing texts with texts. But the most powerful tool in our spiritual armor is the Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 18 weapon, the power of prayer. That spiritual connection between heaven and earth is the best tool to understand and unlock the secrets of the prophetical book of Daniel and all of the other books in the Holy Scriptures also. And it will also draw people into an even deeper and closer walk with God if it is consistent in your daily walk. Remember, pray without ceasing. Let us summarize this book before we go into detail. Using biblical symbolism of different animals and different metals, it prophesied the rise of 4 major world empires: the Neo-Babylonian Chaldean Empire in Iraq, beginning with King Nebuchadnezzar II, who is succeeded by its next door neighbor and former military ally in Western Asia, the Achaemenid Empire, known as the First Medo-Persian Empire in Iran, founded by King Cyrus the Great. That kingdom is eventually overthrown and succeeded by the young Macedonian ruler in the West, Alexander, who has been titled the Great, who put Greece on the world map. And the 4th empire who succeeds Greece is Rome, who in both its pagan and papal form expands its empire all over the earth. But as powerful as it may look on the surface, like its predecessors, it will have a temporal supremacy, but eventually morally crumble from the inside. The prophetic language is spiritual Babylon is fallen, before it will be also overthrown by a 5th and way more powerful eternal kingdom, one that is set up by God himself that will last forever. There are people who are earnestly looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, where everything will be recreated all over again. I know it is very difficult for our finite minds to even imagine living in a world that is different to its present and current state, where all of the living creatures, whether they be in the water, on land or in the air, will all live in perfect harmony. But if we can confidently read prophecy and it accurately guides us in detail through time from the past to the present, then we can have confidence that it will clearly guide us into the future. But what do the teachings of this current world have to offer us?
This is New London. Everyone's happy here.
Everyone has a place. There's no hunger, no violence.
There's no pain there, John. Everyone fits. All you have to do is connect.
There are countless planets throughout the universe. Astronomers think it's only a matter of time before some alien life forms are discovered.
Aliens exist and President Trump knows about it. That's according to Israel's former space security chief.
During the Cold War, 1961, there were about 50 UFOs in formation flying south from Russia to across Europe. And the Supreme Allied Commander was very concerned and about ready to press the panic button when they turned around and went back over the North Pole.
Every element in our body was synthesized in other stars before it got here. So yeah, we're all stardust.
So the first incarnation was Matsya Avtara. That means God appeared in the form of a fish. And you know, Charles Darwin went about proving the first form of life on the planet were water life, fish.
Students that are being taught modern Western philosophy are only being introduced to a continuation, or you could say a revival, of pagan ideology from the ancient world, from their lecturers. Whether they believe you come from fishes or stars, or you're being visited by modern aliens or the ancient Sumerian Anunnaki, man does not change his beliefs over thousands of years. And he also tries to immerse himself into this escapist fantasy world to avoid reality via entertainment, which is really edutainment. Whether you are introduced into science fiction writer Isaac Asimov's galactic civilization in the book that inspired Star Wars, Foundation, or what has been classified as the best sci-fi novel, Frank Herbert's feudal interstellar society to control planetary fiefs in Dune, man is looking for a make-believe outlet by holding on to fictitious characters and heroes. And if you carefully analyze these programs in detail, they all show a very dark and grim dystopian view of the future with no hope or a humanistic view of salvation. Even Cyberpunk's founder in interviews admits that he is sharing a very dark view of the future of this planet we call Earth. But Bible prophecy not only briefly mentions the dark future of this planet, which is a reality we cannot ignore, but it also offers us hope and reassurance at the very end. The book of Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 2 and 3 records, "And the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision or prophecy and make it plain upon tables, so the common man can easily understand it, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, and highlighted in red, it will not tarry." In Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 37, it also confirms and says, "For yet a little while, and he," talking about the second coming of Christ, "that shall come, will come," and also highlighted in red, "and will not tarry." In the book, The History of the Negro Race, this definitive prophetic position is also confirmed by George Washington Williams when he said that in order to prophesy in the scriptural meaning of the word, a man must have the divine unction and must be moved by the Holy Ghost. And in addition to this, it should be said that a true prophecy always comes to pass, is sure of fulfillment. When the Roman Empire was at its zenith, expanding its territory throughout vast tracts of lands in Afro-Eurasia under Julius or Augustus Caesar's successors, at that time a Roman Jewish historian advised what is the best way to clearly understand the future of this world. And diverting us to prophecy, Flavius Josephus in the 1st century AD said that there was a certain captive who came from Judea, a Jew by birth, but brought away thence by Nebuchadnezzar when he had destroyed Jerusalem, whose name was Daniel, a wise man and one of great sagacity in finding out what was impossible for others to discover, and what was known to God alone, who brought light and answered such questions to Nebuchadnezzar as no one else was able to answer when they were consulted. Yet if any be so desirous of knowing truth as not to weigh such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding his uncertainty of futurity or the future, And whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. So our journey will start from the Middle East in the Orient, then it will divert into Europe, the West in the Occident, and the last world's power expansion of its territory across the entire globe. We shall quote 5 highly respected scholars despite their different views on predestination or Arianism to set the ball rolling before we go into the Holy Scriptures. Scotland Yard is the headquarters of London's Metropolitan Police, whose current building overlooks the River Thames, and it is responsible for the policing of the 32 boroughs of London in England. It replaces the old building in St. James, but its original headquarters were in Whitehall, and during the reign of terror of Jack the Ripper in London in the 19th century, it appointed a man as the second Assistant Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police. In London's Kensal Green Cemetery are the buried remains of this man, Sir Robert Anderson, who was not only an intelligent officer but a theologian and student of Bible prophecy. And when he was not fighting crime, he would write books like The Coming Prince. And continuing the school of prophetic interpretation, he said, "In a dream, King Nebuchadnezzar saw a great image of which the head was gold, the breast and arms of silver, the body brass, the legs iron, and the feet partly of iron and partly potter's ware. Then a stone, hewn without hands, struck the feet of the image, and it fell and crumbled to dust, and the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. As the vision of the 2nd chapter specifies the 4 empires which were to successively to rule the world, and as the 7th chapter also enumerates 4 kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome in turn sought to grasp universal dominion, whose destruction is to be one of the events of the second advent of Christ." In London's Westminster Cathedral are the buried remains of Sir Isaac Newton. His posthumous work, The Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse, continues the prophetic school of thinking. And this English scientist said, "Now in this vision of the image composed of 4 metals, the foundation of all Daniel's prophecies is laid. It represents a body of 4 successive nations which should reign over the earth successively. The people of Babylonia, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And by a stone cut out without hands which fell upon the feet of the image and broke all the 4 metals to pieces, and became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. It further represents that a new kingdom shall arise after the 4 and conquer all those nations and grow very great and last to the end of all ages. In the next visions, the 4 beasts, the prophecy of the 4 empires is repeated." In London's St. Paul's Cathedral are the buried remains of an Anglican bishop, Thomas Newton. And in his 18th century dissertations on the prophecies, he also confirmed that Daniel's first prophecy, and the groundwork, as I may say, of all the rest, was his interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of a great image. Thus it pleased God to reveal unto Daniel, and by Daniel unto Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest and most single events of this world. In the stone cut out without hands, which break in pieces the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and the clay, we have a figure of Christ. Christ will put an end to all earthly empires, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 24, that he shall put down all rule and all authority and power. What was revealed unto Nebuchadnezzar in the 2nd year of his reign concerning the 4 empires of the world was again revealed unto Daniel in chapter 7, with some enlargement and additions in the 1st year of Belshazzar. In Cassell's Illustrated Bible of the 19th century, the commentary on Daniel also says that in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the 4 great monarchies that were to succeed each other were represented under the likeness of a great image composed of 4 great metals, gold, silver, brass, and iron. These same monarchies are spoken of under the figures of 4 great beasts, the 4 great dynasties which should arise, the Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, and Roman. Stone cut out without hands can be referred to nothing less than the one spiritual, universal kingdom of Messiah. Translated into English are the works of Swiss-based French reformer John Calvin, who in the 16th century also continued an established position, when he recorded that. Daniel records how Nebuchadnezzar saw an image consisting of gold, silver, brass, and iron, but its feet were a mix, partly of iron and partly of clay. The kingdom of Christ is said to break up all of the empires of the world. Christ is called a stone cut out without hands because he was from the beginning almost without form and comeliness, as far as human appearance goes. The four monarchies following each other in succession, interpreters of moderate judgment and candor, all explain the passage of the Babylonian, Persian, Macedonian and Roman monarchies, and Daniel himself after shows this sufficiently by his own words. The comparison of empire to beast is easily explained. It is here that the four monarchies are here depicted. So this is the historicist position that summarizes the key message of the prophetic book of Daniel. Now let us weigh up their words with the actual text of that book. In Genesis chapter 10 verses 8, 9 and 10, it records that Nimrod set up his first kingdom in the land of Shinar or Sumer in Iraq. And in Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2 again, the land of Shinar was also the home of Nebuchadnezzar's chief deity. No images of Nebuchadnezzar have been discovered, just his name engraved on many, many different tablets. He was a bit of an egoist. One of his tablets shows his vast building project. He was a brilliant architect, and in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany is his famous Ishtar Gate. It is beautiful with bright painted colors all over the brickwork, especially the color blue. But what role did this monarch play in the course of human history? And how reliable are the biblical historical accounts with the archaeological records? Let us go to the Holy Scriptures and see if it can be accurately relied upon, and we shall quote 4 passages from one of the 2 co-prophets of Daniel, Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 24 and verse 1 records that men of Judah were carried away into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar. That included the prophets Daniel and Ezekiel. Jeremiah chapter 52 verses 12, 13 and 14 records that Nebuzaradan, Nebuchadnezzar's chief captain, burned up Jerusalem and he broke down its walls. Jeremiah chapter 46 verses 1 and 2 mentions the Egyptian pharaoh who was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar II, Pharaoh Necho or Necho II, by the river Euphrates. And Jeremiah chapter 36 and verse 4 records the name of Baruch, the son of Neriah, who wrote what Jeremiah said when he was incarcerated. Let us look at the evidence. Recently, archaeologists found a number of artifacts in Jerusalem and in Iraq that proved the invasion of Jerusalem was accurate. They have been labeled the Al-Yahuda or the City of Judah tablets, and the deciphering of the language of these tablets prove that the Jews were indeed captive in Babylon, confirming the accuracy of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. This tablet in the British Museum is Nebuchadnezzar, documenting his invasion of Jerusalem, that also confirms the 3 prophetic books also. Archaeologists also discovered that Jerusalem was burned at the invasion, and the London Independent also confirmed that the Bible is historically accurate. So these findings destroy the arguments of the modern skeptics and critics. More and more evidence is showing that the prophetic book of Jeremiah is being supported by the archaeological record. The British Museum has a tablet with the name of Nebo-Sarsekim, a name documented in Jeremiah chapter 39 and verse 3, who was Nebuchadnezzar's chief officer in 587 BC. They also discovered the seal of Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch, the son of Neriah, in Jerusalem, written in 7th century BC Hebrew. And the 26th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh Necho or Necho II has also been unearthed that shows the events at that time are accurate. But when King Nebuchadnezzar II thought that he reached the pinnacle of his success, when pondering on the future, something very interesting happened to him while he was in a very deep sleep. According to Layard's discoveries in the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, he wrote that Nebuchadnezzar the Great, whose reign began, it may be inferred from Ptolemy's on the bottom left canon, BC 604. Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 1 tells us that the 4th year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, after the death of his father. And Daniel chapter 2 verses 1, 37, 38 tells us that it was in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which was 603 BC, that God revealed to a secular heathen king a prophetic panoramic view of human history from his day right down to the earth made new. And God identified him and his Babylonian system as the symbol of that head of gold. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 14 and verse 4 also identifies Babylon as gold, so it is confirmed by 2 witnesses. In Daniel chapter 7 verses 1 and 4, in the 1st year of King Belshazzar's reign, the last Neo-Babylonian monarch, Babylon is symbolically identified as a lion with eagle's wings. And Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 17 also symbolically identifies Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon as a lion, also confirmed by 2 witnesses. Ezekiel chapter 17 verses 1 to 12 and Habakkuk 1 and verse 8 also symbolically identifies Babylon as an eagle. So Nebuchadnezzar was shown a vast history of the world, and that history began with him, the head of gold. Artifacts in the British Museum show that these were already identified symbols of that kingdom, from the head with its distinct Near Eastern features, a beautifully designed golden helmet, and one of the oldest deities in ancient Babylon, whose name is Do-Good, has the head of a lion and the broad wings of an eagle. So God used something the Babylonians were already familiar with to identify the first kingdom. This tablet shows the surrender of the Babylonian kingdom, and there are tablets that also have the name of King Belshazzar. He was to be overthrown by another kingdom that Daniel chapter 2 and verse 39 said would be inferior. And commentators unconsciously quote the book of Daniel using this scenario.
The writing was kind of on the wall for AJ, and I'm glad AJ got down to business.
When the 45th US president did not win a second term and he had to hand over power to his successor, the British newspaper The Daily Express described his defeat as the writing on the wall, a commonly used term to describe the fall of an individual or a system. It comes from the book of Daniel, where the Hebrew words of denunciation, Mene, Tekel, Yophronson, were written by the finger of God in King Belshazzar's palace when describing the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And the London Guardian newspaper once drew a satire piece of the Bush administration's war calamities, using that divine denunciation in Daniel chapter 5. Today, Western linguists are making painstaking efforts in an attempt to decipher one of the earliest known scripts of Iran, known as Proto-Elamite, so that they can get a clearer picture of Iranian and early human history. The oldest prosthetic eye was discovered in Iran on a buried princess, and the Elamite culture in southern Iran were able from very early to intricately carve into different metals the human form from either bronze, copper, gold, or silver, showing that early Iranians were very advanced. The British Museum shows some of the carved representations of the Iranian people, from this early woman down to the Achaemenid Empire, where the men are all usually depicted as fully bearded, a long straight nose, earrings, and a kind of turban on their head. Iran has also left a lasting influence on modern culture. One of the earliest Elamite deities is depicted with horns and curled up shoes, and today it is in Western culture known as the Joker in the pack of cards. We use passports to travel from one country to another, and within the Medo-Persian Empire, the London Guardian documented that the very first use in history of the passport was when the prophet Nehemiah asked for permission from King Artaxerxes to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. This is the tomb in Iran of the Medo-Persian monarch King Cyrus II, also known as the Great. And in the British Museum is the famous Cyrus cylinder. He is mentioned in the books of Ezra, Daniel, and also prophesied in the book of Isaiah. And his famous cylinder that offered a liberty throughout his empire is the foundation of modern-day human rights, where many of modern laws are modelled on this famous decree from the Persian monarch King Cyrus. The Medo-Persians also adopted many of the practices from surrounding nations, according to Herodotus' account, especially the Babylonians. And as you carefully observe the pagan iconography in Babylonian art, it was inherited from the already nature-worshipping culture of Persia, Iraq's next-door neighbor. The expansion of their empire that covered Afro-Eurasia, that stretched into the Nile, the Mediterranean and the Indus, according to Esther chapter 1 and verse 1, was possible due to the loyalty of their vast military, and it came into the prophetic radar where her rise was documented by 3 Hebrew prophets, and God intervened in world affairs. A Western scholar, when describing the rise of Medo-Persia, Sir Austin Henry Layard, wrote that the fingers of the man's hand wrote the words of condemnation of the Babylonian Empire upon a plaster wall of the king's palace, Daniel 5:5. The neighboring kingdoms of Media and Persia, united under one monarch, had profited no less than Babylon by the ruins of the Assyrian Empire and were ready to dispute with her the dominion of Asia. Scarcely half a century had elapsed from the fall of Nineveh when Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, Daniel 5:30-31. The description given by Herodotus, the Greek historian, fully tallies with the denunciations of the Hebrew prophets against the wickedness of Babylon. Her inhabitants had lost their warlike character. When the Persians broke into their city, they were reveling in debauchery and lust. And when the Macedonian conqueror appeared at their gates, they received with indifference the yoke of a new master. It was through Babylon that the arts appear to have penetrated partly, if not entirely, into Persia. A lecturer at the University of Chicago seconded his words the following century, and he documented it in a book titled History of the Persian Empire, published in 1948. And American historian Albert Tennock Olmsted also wrote that the Old Testament throws as much light on the history of Persia. Highly centralized in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonia had progressively disintegrated under weakling rule of Belshazzar. Misrule and graft were rampant, the peasants were oppressed, and their fields went out of cultivation. In the Jewish story of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar set up a statue which all the world must worship. Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. Daniel the Jew interpreted the dream, which pronounced the hoped-for doom against Babylon and foretold the future. Belshazzar, the sensual despot, was warned by the writing on the palace wall only when it was too late for repentance. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BC, the world was old. When the book of Isaiah was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, they also discovered in the 1990s a small clay bulla of Ahaz, king of Judah, written in 8th century BC Hebrew. And in the prophetic book of Isaiah, a century before Daniel, in the year King Ahaz died, was the first prophecy of the rise of Medo-Persia, overthrowing Babylon. Daniel's co-prophet Jeremiah in chapter 51 also mentions twice the Medes' role in the overthrowing of the Babylonian kingdom. Not once or twice, but 3 times during the reign of Belshazzar was the Medo-Persian Empire prophesied. In chapter 7, they were symbolically described as a bear. In chapter 8, they were symbolically described as a ram. And in chapter 5, God directly told Belshazzar that he will be overthrown. They were first symbolically mentioned in the 2nd chapter of Daniel as the inferior kingdom that had the breast and arms of silver. And this is confirmed by Dr. Wiley, who said silver, though scarce, is represented by the short-lived kingdom of Medo-Persia. So God used a bear, a carnivorous animal, to symbolize Medo-Persia, and also a ram with 2 horns. You may wonder why the ram was used. In the Medo-Persian section of the British Museum is a metallic carving of a ram with 2 horns. And throughout Iranian art, this clay jar on the left, dated to 3000 BC, has a ram with 2 horns painted on the top, and the jar on the right, dated to around 900 to 700 BC, has similar motifs on its design. The silver ram on the top left, dated to 3000 BC. The earthenware rhyton on the bottom left, dated to around the 6th to the 5th century BC. And the one on the right, made from lapis lazuli, dated around the same time, shows the prophetic ram with 2 horns. And archaeologists have also observed that the oldest rock art in Iran, 90% of the earliest petroglyphs, also shows the ibex or the ram with two horns as described by the prophet Daniel. The British Museum also shows that the Iranians use silver in their art, from their deities to their coins, and from their oldest silver Elamite cups dated around 3000 BC to Iranian war helmets 2 centuries ago in the 19th century. As we pan across the history of Iranian art, the system that was prophetically described as silver was the perfect description of this kingdom. But it wasn't to last forever. It was also to be replaced and succeeded by another kingdom. In Genesis, it documents the earliest human migration program, and in chapter 10 and verse 2, it mentions the name of Javan, the descendant of Japheth, whose descendants settled in southern Europe from Anatolia in Asia Minor. In a book titled The Origin of Nations, published in 1877, Oxford professor and historian George Rawlinson, describing the origin of the Greeks before they entered onto the prophetic radar, said, Javan is the nearest possible expression in Hebrew of the Greek term which we render by Ionians, the original form of which in Greek was Iafones. Why and how is uncertain, but the fact is indisputable that the Orientals use this term universally as the generic name for the Greek race. The Assyrians call the Greeks of Cyprus the Yavnan, the Persians call those of Asia Minor, and the Aegean Islands the Una. The terms Greek, Hellene, Achaean, Dorian were unknown in Asia, or at any rate unused by the Asiatics generally, being superseded by the name Ionian, with which alone they were familiar. The Greeks of Europe, who regard themselves as the product of their own soil, and suppose that all other Greeks elsewhere must of necessity have sprung from them, dated the foundation of Greek colonies in Cyprus from the time of the Trojan War, or about BC 1250, according to the earlier chronologists. We see the Greek passing from the simple, semi-savage state described by Homer to the condition of high civilization by Thucydides and Xenophon. Recent discoveries in DNA have shown that the early Greek culture of ancient Crete were white Europeans, even though you can clearly see by looking at them with their different skin tones and distinct facial features. And unbeknownst to George Rawlinson, they were very technologically advanced from early. The artifacts in museums in England show that they intricately carved into all types of different materials to produce different forms of exquisite art, and they also had distinct alphabetic scripts where only one has been deciphered, Linear B. The boats we see today in use were already around in ancient Crete, as can be seen by these ancient seals that have the double mast and sail in the center. There is nothing new. Their very strong architecture was so solid with very stable beams that it has been able to withstand modern day earthquakes. And while we are deceived into believing that we are more advanced today, they were the first to introduce the flushing toilet into the privacy of the home, according to modern scientists. The elite also had central heating, and they also had both cold and hot running water. And while Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the English engineer, built London's sewage system in the 19th century, in the 2nd millennium BC, the people of Crete already had throughout their palaces drainage systems, piping systems, and tanks and basins designed for collecting rain water. The latter Athenian Greeks also produced one of the most realistic forms of naturalistic art in the ancient world, from their sculptures to their state coinage, where the modern world standard of beauty is modeled after the ancient Greek female form in their sculpture. They also had the first computer, a mathematical device that predicted astronomical positions and eclipses, and it could also calculate the 4-year cycle of the Olympiads. It is known as the Antikythera mechanism. They were also influenced by surrounding cultures. The cylinder seal was adopted into Crete from Babylon, and when the Assyrian monarch Esarhaddon invaded Cyprus in the 7th century BC, the Greek Cypriot males incorporated the Assyrian fashion of very long beards, and like the Medo-Persians, they also adopted the Babylonian human-headed winged deity. Albert Tennyson Olmsted documented that the Greeks Anaximander, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Hales all learned their astronomical and philosophical teachings from the culture of ancient Babylon also. Dr. Wiley expands on this and says, with the failure of Greek philosophy, all the wisdom of the previous ages had failed as the true guide of men to happiness. For the schools of Chaldea, of Egypt, of Phoenicia, and of all the earth had emptied their treasures into the schools of Greece, that through Athens as the embodiment of the world's wisdom. What influences has the Athenian Greek culture left on our modern world? We inherited the Olympics, Carnival, democracy, the modern theatre, the Hippocrates Oath, and the symbol in medicine from the Greeks. In ideology, the image of the Greek god Zeus is still worshipped today inside of the churches. They call him Jesus, but this is not Jesus, this is actually Zeus. Plato's philosophy influenced the early church fathers, Justin Martyr on the left and Augustine on the right, that still influences Christian thought today. One of the main issues of the many Pauline letters in the early church was the struggle with Greek philosophy versus the simplicity of the everlasting gospel. Greek art also shows images of pederasty, big grown men with young boys and little children. My goodness, a behavior still practiced in the West today. And gymnasiums that also came from Greece were originally designed for a liaison between men, another behavior inherited in modern times from Greece. The Greeks were the first to use media through the arts and drama, where their double-faced insignia is still in use today. It was used to sway public opinion, and when Paul Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Germany's propagandist, wanted to sway public opinion, he used one of two books, Crystallizing Public Opinion by a Jew, Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew. When US President Calvin Coolidge's ratings were down, Edward Bernays told him to take photos with celebrities on the White House lawn, and when he did, his ratings boosted. With governments trying to convince civilians to take the vaccine, the strategy from Greece, as Bernays documented, are what modern health systems are using. For Britain's NHS is attempting to use famous celebrities to persuade the British public into taking the COVID-19 vaccine. Hollywood is a continuation of the Greek school of persuading the public mind.
Do you want to win the war on terror? Yes or no? This is the quintessential yes or no question of our time.
But when Western monopolies want to steal another nation's natural resources to enhance its profits, theft is called war. And the Greek stage is a vehicle where opportunist actors are used as pawns for US national interests. But using propaganda to justify warfare is not a new thing. In the British Museum is a bust of Pericles, the 5th century BC Athenian Greek statesman, orator, and general, whose legacy was preserved by Thucydides. Pericles instituted the principle of publicity to influence the societal opinion in diplomacy. And as you go through the museum, you will see the military attire of the Greek culture that they first used on each other to conquer new terrain. But the Greek Macedonian leader Philip II wanted to expand the Greek Empire outside of its territorial limits. His dreams were crushed when he was sadly assassinated, and the eldest of his two sons took the mantle, and the king, Alexander III of Macedon, titled the Great, now came into the prophetic picture where power was now transferred from the east to the west. In Daniel chapter 11 verses 1, 2, 3 and 4, within the Medo-Persian Empire in the 6th century BC, the rise of Alexander's Greek Empire was prophesied as overtaking the Medo-Persians before it was eventually divided into 4 pieces. In both Daniel chapter 7 and 8, it shows the 4 divisions are actually 4 kingdoms, where Greece is symbolized as both an he-goat with 1 horn and a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. In Daniel chapter 2 and verse 39, Greece is symbolically described as the 3rd kingdom of brass. And Dr. Wiley is clear that the period of bronze and brass, as exemplified in the powerful brazen-coated Greeks. Alexander the Great's Greece was symbolized as the solitary feline, the ferocious camouflage spotted hunter, the wildcat, the leopard, and a number of his coins has imprinted upon it his likeness, and protruding out of the top of his head is a horn, a very fitting description of how he is symbolically described in Daniel chapter 8 verses 5 and 21. He came onto the prophetic map when he entered the reign of the Western Asian kingdom, whose rulers' names all end with the letter S, the Medo-Persian Empire, when he defeated King Darius III, as this mosaic painting depicts the battle. But for all his unconquerable defeats, he died at the young age of 32, and his empire was eventually divided among Ptolemy I, Seleucus I, Lysimachus, and Cassander, his 4 generals, the 4 heads and wings of the leopard. There is also a Babylonian astronomical diary in the British Museum that records Alexander's death. But Greece, the kingdom symbolized as brass, a leopard and an he-goat, was to be succeeded by the 4th and last kingdom on this earth, that today is slowly and very stealthily picking up momentum to restore its supremacy and world domination.
The Vatican is the last absolute monarchy in the world today. The Pope, when he is elected, is answerable to no human power. He has absolute authority over the entire Roman Catholic Church, direct authority that reaches down to individual members. He is the supreme judge, the supreme legislator, and the supreme executive.
Throughout the 20th century leading into the 21st century, the papacy has skillfully boosted her public relations profile by courting the world's most famous faces in every single field, from sportsmen, scientists, presidents, bankers, actors and their children, and civil rights leaders and their children also, so that she can be seen as a peacemaker and go undetected and not be identified as that last world power on the prophetic timetable. The late Pope John Paul II kissed a Quran as an ecumenical strategy to win over the sympathy of the Muslim world. But one of their clever strategies is to win over the hearts of the different major and also minor world religions and different beliefs, and sadly it's working very, very successfully. The papacy has been able to covertly steer the direction and foreign policy of nations and model it after their religio-political ideology without the masses even being aware of it. During the Cold War, the Western intelligence agencies, the CIA of the USA and MI6 of the UK, both were infiltrated and controlled by Catholic agents, the Knights of Malta. This has been confirmed by the most respected intelligence author in the world, British writer Nigel West, who documented it in 2 of his books, The Third Secret and The Secret War for the Falklands. And the Catholic press not secretly but openly admits it. She does not even hide it. But what influence does she have on global governments and institutions today? While many people's eyes are focused on the Billionaires Club, the World Economic Forum, and their Great Reset COVID-19 World Order agenda, most, if not all, have overlooked the system who is saying the exact same thing and who is also leading the charge and having an even deeper impact. On Earth Day in 2020, Pope Francis I said the world should be following his New Age encyclical Laudato Si for a global ecological mandate.
Today we celebrate the 50th Earth Day. The encyclical letter Laudato Si deals precisely with this. The subtitle says this precisely: care for our common home.
The Vatican is also pushing for a rethink of the global financial system. And the Pope said that the COVID-19 pandemic has given us a chance to develop new ways of living. Some call it disaster capitalism. And documented in Thomson Reuters News that he has called for a green recovery. And since he made that statement, the entire world has been dancing to his tune in restructuring the world order.
Tonight we ask, how can we make sure the recovery from the pandemic is green?
Could a green recovery be the solution to saving the global economy?
Our title, A Green and Better Recovery,
For all?
I'm not just dealing with the recession right now, but also climate change. And what economists have found is that we could kill two birds with one stone by getting a green recovery.
The green recovery represents an unprecedented opportunity to rethink and reset the ways in which we live and do business.
Pope Francis I's green recovery is now being followed by 220 regional governments that includes Britain's Boris Johnson, America's Joe Biden, the bank system all over the world that includes the IMF and World Bank, who are pushing for the Pope's green recovery. The United Nations and the Rockefeller Foundation, who is pumping $1 billion into the Pope's green recovery program. And this is the major impact the papacy has on global institutions. All that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. But what about vaccines?
Over at the Vatican, religious leaders have declared the COVID-19 vaccine morally acceptable.
Pope Francis calls for ethical production and fair distribution of COVID vaccines. The Vatican begins vaccinating its own residents, becoming an example for other states.
As the Pope encourages the world to take the COVID vaccine, and while many tiptoe around the issue, it will start off as a choice, but then they will continue to find different strains around the world, then start to pressure society. And as the film Divergent forewarns us, they will start marginalizing those who do not conform. You may wonder how this will work. In Russia, they are creating COVID-19 vaccination certificates for cross-border travels. A similar process is taking place in LA. In France, they are pushing a bill that those who do not take the vaccine will be banned from public transport. In the UK, they will be restricted from sports events and cinemas. In Spain, they will be kept on a register. You could even lose your job. And where is all this leading up to? Arutz Sheva, the Israeli newspaper, said, government won't force you to take the vaccine, but Amazon will, airlines will, banks will, and you won't be able to buy or sell or trade without the vaccine. So the vaccine will be used as a pilot scheme for that very last global economic test, as forewarned in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 17, where the entire earth, regardless of your age, your gender, your race, your sexuality, or your social status, will be put to the test. This is why the Pope is endorsing it. He knows exactly where it is leading to.
This morning, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism announcing a new partnership between the Pope, the Vatican, and business leaders across the globe. It follows a meeting just over a year ago in which the Pope Francis called for the urgent need for an economic system that is fair, trustworthy, and capable of addressing the most profound challenges facing humanity. Executives are now committing to the Council's pledge to create a more sustainable and equitable system. They include Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, Johnson & Johnson CEO Alex Gorski, CalPERS CEO Marcy Frost, and Merck CEO Ken Frazier. And joining us right now is the founder of that council, Lynn Forster de Rothschild. Lynn, good morning to you. You are the brainchild of this idea, and I'm curious if you could even just tell us how you convinced the Vatican and the Pope to embrace capitalism.
So we are responding to his call to reform capitalism.
Most are unaware that the Vatican has been a business partner with the Rothschild family and with other corporations for centuries. Let's give a brief background analysis. The London Economist said the Catholic Church in North America is larger than any other of the corporations or businesses. Her global fraternal service, the Knights of Columbus, has $100 billion worth of life insurance. She has received a $1 to $3 billion payout of coronavirus federal aid by the US government. Crazy. But she has already been receiving $1.6 billion worth of US contracts since 2012. She collects 6 billion euros in tax in Germany and excommunicates Catholics who refuse to pay church tax. And she also has a colossal property empire in London. Nobody on this earth can truly calculate the wealth of this multi-gazillion dollar empire. For in just Australia alone, her wealth of church-owned properties is estimated at $30 billion, where she transfers $2.3 billion to Australia and does not want to give an account for it. German banker Meyer Amschel founded the Rothschild banking dynasty, whose coat of arms include the double eagle insignia of the Holy Roman Empire. and in the 19th century, Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian diplomat, was the liaison between James Mayer de Rothschild and Karl Mayer von Rothschild when they transferred a number of large major financial loans to Pope Gregory XVI, who oversaw the loan deal between the Rothschild family and the Holy See. This is documented by the late David Yallop, a British investigative writer who, when investigating the mysterious death of Pope John Paul I in his book In God's Name, he recorded that the tentacles of Vatican Incorporated spread worldwide. Close links were forged with an array of banks. Rothschilds of Paris and London had been doing business with the Vatican since the early 19th century. This has been seconded in a book titled The Vatican Billions, where the late Italian-born British-based investigative writer Avro Manhattan said that the Vatican has billions of shares in Shell, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, General Electric, International Business Machines, that is IBM, and TWA. The Vatican's treasures of gold has been estimated by the United Nations World Magazine to amount to $7 billion. The Catholic Church is the largest owner of historic, architectural and artistic buildings in the world. The Catholic Church is the oldest, largest and most impressive art collector of all time. The Church becomes ipso facto the greatest billionaire concern on account of her artistic treasures alone. The celebrated Jewish house of Rothschild, who incidentally had been lending money to the Vatican since 1831, came once more to the fore with the buying, selling and amalgamating of millions of shares and other investments on behalf of the Vatican. The beginning of this liaison between the Rothschilds and the Vatican was in 1969 to 70. So the Vatican-Rothschild alliance has been an ongoing liaison for 2 solid centuries. But though the Vatican was instrumental in attempting to restore her sovereignty in the biggest horrific bloodbath in human history during the Second World War, and created an escape route for those same war criminals to avoid trials, it seems like only a few in the secular world are aware of her true aims. In a book titled The Vatican Against Europe, the late French writer Edmond Paris said, "Will there come a time when the Western peoples returning to wisdom will examine the Vatican question calmly in the light of history?" In another book titled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, the late Russian-American writer Ayn Rand said that the Catholic Church has never given up the hope to re-establish the medieval union of church and state with a global state and a global theocracy as its ultimate goal. The modern churches are silent concerning the papacy, with maybe the odd occasional voice. But men centuries ago, by studying the book of Daniel, knew that Rome, in both its pagan and papal form, was the last of the world kingdoms. In Northern Europe, in Edinburgh, Scotland, there was a huge church, and inside of that church there was a statue of the 16th century Scottish reformer John Knox, known as the Thundering Scot. He is buried somewhere in the church car park, but in his work, The History of the Reformation in Scotland, using the book of Daniel as his guide, John Knox said, "A short discourse of the 4 empires, the Babylonian, the Persian, that of the Greeks, and the 4th of the Romans, is the destruction whereof rose up that last beast, which ye affirm to be the Roman Church. For to none other power that hath yet been, do all the notes that God hath shewed to the prophet appertain, except to it alone. And unto it do they so properly appertain, that such as not more than blind may clearly see them." Oxford has a very long tradition of educating many brilliant minds, and in the grounds of London's St. Paul Cathedral is a statue of one of its students, the ordained Anglican minister and founder of the Methodists, John Wesley. At the Museum of London, at the front entrance, is a plaque with one of John Wesley's famous sayings, and in his famous chapel that he built, that was also the place of his home where he preached, studied and wrote books against the Atlantic slave trade, the importance of health reform, and his infamous notes on the New Testament. He said concerning the last power, "Daniel's 4th beast is the Roman monarchy. This very beast, and so Rome with its last authority, is comprehended under that of Daniel. The first 3 beasts in Daniel are like a leopard, a bear, and a lion. In all parts except his feet and mouth, this beast was like a leopard or female panther, which is fierce as a lion or bear, but is also swift and subtle. Such is the papacy, which has partly by subtlety, partly by force, gained power over so many nations. Out of the sea, that is, Europe, the beast is the Romish papacy. To this and to no other power on earth agrees the whole text, and every part of it in every point. It is one of the same beast, having 7 heads and 10 horns, which is described in this and the 17th chapter. The man of sin, the son of perdition, the Pope has an indisputable claim to those titles. In the book The Approaching End of the Age, Irish-born British evangelist and prophetic scholar Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness, continuing and elaborating a lesson on what John Wesley said, the book of Daniel is one of the fullest revelations of the future contained in the Bible. It is unequaled for the minuteness of its historical detail and for its breadth of range, both chronological and geographical. A succession of 4 empires is foretold, and that they are to be followed by a 5th, the Empire of the Stone. By universal consent, the first are allowed to be the Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, and the Roman empires, and the last, the still future kingdom of the Son of Man. The man of sin is the succession of Roman pontiffs who for more than 12 centuries governed papal Europe, who ranked as temporal sovereigns and united under their sway the kingdoms of Western Christendom. In Daniel's vision, the power in question is represented as a horn of the Roman beast, a little horn. The man of sin is called the son of perdition, and this name applied by our Lord to Judas Iscariot, the traitor, would prepare us to find the man of sin, the Antichrist. The Babylonian harlot is represented as enthroned upon many waters, which are nations and peoples. She is not only a church, but a church ruling nations. That is, she claims a temporal as well as a spiritual sway. She governs the beast and his 10 horns, and so unites a religious and civil supremacy. Now, this is one of the striking characteristics of the Church of Rome, and of that church only. Thomas Goodwin, Sir Isaac Newton, Bishop Thomas Newton, and John Cassell also identified Papal Rome as the very last world power who was prophesied in the book of Daniel. But there was one scholar who identified all the characteristic traits in Papal Rome that she inherited from all the previous kingdoms. And Dr. Wiley, in his very first thesis in 1851, said, "The papacy is a new Babel in which the old redoubtable idolaters are the builders. It is a spiritual pantheon in which the local and vagrant superstitions find again a center and a home. Analyze popery and you'll find all these ancient systems existing in it. The ancient Chaldean worshipping the sun, the Greek deifying the powers of nature. In popery we find the predominant traits of Grecian philosophy, more especially in the casuistry of the popish schools. The Roman exalting the race of primeval men into gods. The polytheism of ancient Rome in the gods and goddesses which, under the title of saints, filled up the calendar and crowded the temples of the Romish Church. The Magian or Medo-Persian philosophy flourishes in the monastic system. Here then all the old idolatries live over again." The Pantheon was a temple in ancient Rome that once housed many of the ancient pagan gods. These gods were later incorporated into Papal Rome. The mother and child image that was once in Egypt in Africa, in China and Japan in Asia, and in Greece in Europe was also adopted as one of the gods into the papal system. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was prophesied in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 20 as a raiser of taxes that was fulfilled in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. This brilliant builder and restorer of paganism put the title of his authority on his coins. He was given the ancient title of the Pontifex Maximus, and this is the same title the popes used for themselves, as a narrator filmed in Vatican City that shows that the popes are not successors of Peter, but successors of Caesar. For just as the Caesars were portrayed as gods, when you go into St. Peter's Basilica, the popes are also portrayed in the exact same fashion. The papal hierarchy of bishops have their serpent-hooked crozier staffs, but they were also used by the priests in ancient Rome and can be seen on the coin of the Roman priest king Julius Caesar in the British Museum. These medieval croziers can be traced all the way back to ancient Babylon. The hand with 3 fingers upright that was dedicated to the god Zeus is also used as the oath for the Vatican's papal Swiss guards. and that celibate priesthood of women, the nunnery, is only a continuation of the Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome, so we can openly and clearly see that papal Rome embodies the legs of iron. But it does not stop there, its roots go even further. Alexander the Great's teacher was Aristotle, and during medieval Europe, Thomas Aquinas was a disciple of the teachings of Aristotle. William Tyndale complained that Greek philosophy and not the Bible is what dominated the education system of papal Europe. And Medo-Persia, the Third King's monastic system, was also incorporated into the papal system. But the first and oldest kingdom, Babylon, Nimrod's system, received a brand new facelift with the papacy. You see, when you see a Hindu, a New Ager, a Muslim, or a Catholic with prayer beads, it can be traced right back to the Babylonian culture. The ancient Chaldeans and the culture of Sumer had the blazing sun worship, where the image of the sun in the form of a cross was all over Mesopotamia, and its 8 shining rays can be traced all the way to those early plains in Iraq. This 8-rayed sun was also incorporated into Vatican City, that has the largest 8-rayed sun disk on the earth, that is inside of a male's phallus. And inside the Vatican, a woman still holds the sun in her arms, and this pagan deity also has a sun disk or halo on its head, a preservation of the ancient pagan system. The sun inside the crescent was also another form of celestial worship in the old Babylonian system. And this is what bishops, priests, and the Pope use when they are performing a mass. It is not to glorify the Son of God, but the Sun God. And as you carefully look at the entire papal system, from the insignia of the Holy See, which is the Babylonian tiaras, and the whole regalia of the papacy that includes the fish mitre, you are seeing a system that, although was overthrown in 539 to 538 BC by the Medo-Persians, Babylon has still been able to flourish and to continue unabated inside of the most powerful geopolitical economic system in all of human history, the papacy. What does the prophecy in both Daniel and the Revelation say concerning it? The last and fourth kingdom highlighted in red in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 40 and chapter 7 and verse 7 strength is the iron, and its conquering is described as breaking into pieces. How does the papacy qualify? Blasphemy is a man who tries to be God, according to John chapter 10 and verse 33, or a man who tries to forgive sins, according to Mark chapter 2 and verse 7. In 1 Peter, Jesus is titled the Chief Shepherd. In Roman Catholic Canon Law 749, the Pope is titled the Chief Shepherd. In John chapter 17 and verse 11, Jesus calls God the Father, the Holy Father. The late Pope John Paul II and his predecessors and successors call themselves the Holy Father, taking God's place. In Daniel chapters 8 and 11, when you parallel the description of the last kingdom, it is pompous and desires all praise for itself, the papacy all over again. And when you parallel the king in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 36, and the man of sin in the temple of God in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4 that exalts itself, it is describing the exact same system. In Daniel, it is a political figure, but in Thessalonians, it is a religious figure. In Revelation chapters 13 and 17, the beasts of Daniel are amalgamated into one system, and the political system in Daniel, the beast, and the religious system in Thessalonians, a woman, are also merged into one and the same system, a religio-political system. So this is the last world power on this earth, according to the prophecy of both Daniel and the book of Revelation. So we have chronicled the rise and fall of the 4 major world empires that were symbolically represented by different metals and by different wild animals, according to prophecy. But what is the real overall message of the prophetic book of Daniel? It is to prepare the entire world for the coming of the stone. But who is that stone that shall destroy all the earthly kingdoms? We shall find out in a while. All around us we see geological and fossil reminders of what happened to the earth when man did not take heed to the first warning of the flood. And the everlasting gospel is going to go to the entire world, lockdown or not. And every human being is going to hear the last invitation message for eternity before this earth is destroyed. Every race, kindred, tongue, and people will hear the everlasting gospel. No one will be exempt, so no one cannot say we did not know. But how will the entire world know what is to come if nobody does not tell them? How will the sophisticated businesswoman in the corporate world hear the gospel if no one does not tell her? What about the dapper-dressed businessmen in the corporate world and other businesses that are functioning? What about the fashion model, the chef, the designer, the photographer, the pilot, the sportsman, the barber, the fireman, the gamers, the military, the DJ, the dancer, the vet, the architects and those in construction? How will the poor, the rich, the prostitutes, the LGBT community, refugees, the elderly, this carefree, secular-minded young generation, those suffering from deep depression and anxiety, the Jew, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the New Age hear it if nobody does not tell them? You will meet some very odd and strange people out there, but it has to go out there, whether in the cities, the jungle, the desert, or the towns and villages, and you will meet those who will flat out reject the last warning message of mercy. But you also have to be a living example. You cannot introduce people to something that you are not practicing or living up to yourself. You have to lead by example. Jesus makes it unequivocally clear in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14 and Revelation chapter 14 and verse 6 that the gospel is going to be preached to the entire world to prepare them to meet the stone. But who is the stone? Both the books of Daniel and the Revelation are guided by the same author according to Daniel chapter 10 and Revelation chapter 1, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And it may shock people, but the entire book of Daniel is not only guided by Jesus Christ, but also prepares you for his second coming. In Matthew chapter 21 and verse 42 and Acts chapter 4 verses 10 and 11, both Jesus and Peter confirm that Jesus is the stone prophesied in Psalms 118 and verse 22. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 34, Jesus is that stone that destroys the image that represents all earthly kingdoms. In both Acts chapter 3 verses 13, 14 and 15 and Acts chapter 5 and verse 30 and 31, Jesus is described as the Prince. And in Daniel chapter 8 verses 11 and 25 and Daniel chapter 11, he is also described as that same Prince of the Covenant. It is one and the same person. In John chapter 1 verses 40 and 41, Andrew said that Jesus was the Messiah. And Jesus in John chapter 4 verses 25 and 26 testified and also confirmed to the woman of Samaria that he was the Messiah. That was a fulfillment of the prophecy of the coming Messiah in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25, in the 69th week or 483rd prophetic year of the 490-year period of the 70 weeks prophecy. It was during the reign of the second Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar, who was prophesied in Daniel chapter 11 verses 20-21, that was a time when Jesus officially became the Christ or Messiah in Luke chapter 3 verses 1, 21-22, where in the year AD 27, Jesus was baptized and officially became the Christ, the Messiah. Sir Robert Anderson said, Daniel the prophet, none can have a higher title to the name, for it was thus Messiah spoke of him. Scotsman Thomas Dix said the prophet Daniel predicted the very time when Messiah should make his appearance, and the circumstances which should precede and accompany it. Why did the Jews expect the Messiah at that time than any other, if that was not the time before appointed for his coming? Bishop Thomas Newton said. The prophet Daniel in particular had foretold in chapter 9 and verse 25 that Messiah Prince should come towards the end of 70 weeks or 490 years from the going forth of the decree to restore and build Jerusalem. Discoveries in Babylon have already confirmed statements of Daniel which were denied by critics. Philip Schaff said. Christ refers to it in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15 as a prophecy spoken by Daniel. The stone cut out of the mountain and the Messiah the Prince can only refer to Christ and his kingdom. The interpretation of the 70 weeks, 490 years, and the explanation of the fourth kingdom or fourth beast of chapter 7 are so closely related that the determination of the one settles the other. If the fourth kingdom be the Roman Empire, then the 70 weeks terminate in the events of Christ's life and the years immediately succeeding. When Jesus died on Calvary in the midst of the last prophetic week of Daniel, he was the one complete sacrifice. But what happened? In both John 19:30 and Matthew chapter 27 verses 50 and 51, when Jesus died and yielded or gave up the ghost, he said, "It is finished." And the veil of the temple was torn into two, completely ending all earthly sacrifices. Matthew Henry said he must cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. By offering himself a sacrifice once for all, he shall put an end to all the Levitical sacrifices, shall supersede them and set them aside. When the substance comes, the shadows shall be done away. He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, John Cassell said. When the Christ bowed his head upon the cross in death, he in fact put an end to the whole Jewish polity. In Daniel 9:27, it records that the Messiah in the middle of the prophetic week shall cause all the earthly sacrifices and the oblation to cease. But it also mentions something else that would happen to Jerusalem after Jesus' death, the abomination that maketh desolate. It is in the preceding verse 26 that it goes into more thorough detail, where it confirms that the desolations is the actual destruction of the city and the sanctuary in Jerusalem by the Romans. And Jesus in both Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15 and Luke chapter 21 verses 20 and 24 quotes Daniel chapter 9 verses 25 and 26 to verify this prophecy, the abomination of desolation in this context. Bishop Thomas Newton said, "The abomination of desolation is the Roman army, and the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place is the Roman army besieging Jerusalem. This, saith our Saviour, is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Flavius Josephus said that Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government and that our country should be made desolate by them. All these things did this man leave in writing as God hath showed them to him, insomuch that as such should read his prophecies and see how they have been fulfilled, would wonder at the honour wherewith God honoured Daniel. This is a testimony of a Jew who saw the prophecy fulfilled in front of his very eyes and also recorded the military events of both Vespasian and Titus, whose busts are both in the British Museum, who fulfilled that prophecy to the T. Jesus in John chapter 10 and verse 36, when declaring his divinity, calls himself the Son of God. And in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 25, he was the one that stepped in to protect the Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. In Luke chapter 9 verses 56, Jesus also calls himself the Son of Man, declaring his humanity. And in Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and 14, the Son of Man will set up the fifth and the final eternal kingdom that will supersede all those previous false ones. But there will be others, those who have already died and those who will stay faithful to the very end, who will be able to enjoy that eternal bliss. Not once, nor twice, but 3 times, God is very clear in Daniel chapter 7 that the saints will inherit that eternal kingdom, and those who are at this time still striving will make it. But with this lockdown, people are really being tested. And if you cannot stand right now, when there is peace and safety, Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 5 says, "If thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace, wherein thou trustest, they weary thee, then how wilt thou do in the swelling of Jordan?" If you cannot stand for God right now in this dark hour, you will not make it at the end. Wherever you are in the world and whatever you believe in, this study was designed to provoke and agitate thought. God has forewarned us of things to come, so none of us are without excuse. At the moment, Every single one of us are on the fence. We are all neutral. But we're going to get to a stage where every single person in the world is going to have to decide where they want to be in the future. And I pray that myself and yourself will make the right decision, because this lockdown is showing that time is running out.